go.
Alicia sent the error that she got. It's like, it just says an error has occurred. Try again or contact customer service.
For Zoom?
No, that was the ReadyTalk error.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I realized what the problem was. We had not gone live. We're now live, so everyone can hear us. We have 41 people on.
Okay. Hi, everybody.
So my apologies to everyone for keeping you waiting. This is our new webinar service. It's Zoom. We are still getting used to it, and I'm not used to having to activate it. But welcome. I'm so glad you're here. I think this is going to be a great webinar. I should let you all know that we are recording it. We are doing that because we know we have some people who could not join us today but would still like to participate in it and benefit from it. So I'm going to do a 2-minute explanation of what this is about and turn it over to our speakers. We have our leadership retreat next week, and we have invited the folks at ProInspire to present their Awake to Woke to Work research, which we think is really powerful. Among other people, Tasha, our board co-chair, has participated in it and thought it was really spectacular. And our ad hoc committee decided that they should present at the retreat. But this stuff is really very difficult and requires a lot of thought. And we felt that if we had a preliminary webinar with them, it would get you guys started thinking if you're coming to the retreat. And it also gives you the opportunity to be exposed to their work if you are not coming to the retreat. So having said that, I am going to turn this over to Carrie-Ann Suarez and Andrew Plumley, who will present Awake to Woke to Work.
Great. Thank you so much. And Andrew and I are happy to be here. I'm Carrie-Ann Suarez, Executive Director of Equity in the Center. And Andrew, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I'm Andrew Plumley, Associate Director at Equity in the Center. It's great to be with you all today.
Well, thanks. And I can share a little bit of context on Equity in the Center. We began as a collaborative that existed outside of any organization back in 2016 and became a project of ProInspire in 2017. And since that time, we published Awake to Woke to Work, which we're going to spend some time talking about today. But Equity in the Center was conceived by a group of nonprofit colleagues that included ProInspire, AmeriCorps alums, Public Allies, and other grantees of the Annie E. Casey Talent Pipelines portfolio to shift mindsets, practices, and systems across the social sector to drive race equity. So our 3 goals as part of shifting the sector in our field building work is to support nonprofits and philanthropic organizations in adopting a race equity culture. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And a race equity culture is when an organization is focused on driving race equity internally in its internal operations and culture and externally in its advocacy and partnerships, supporting organizations in implementing policies and processes and tactics that would support centering it internally and driving equity externally. And one of our big goals, we like to say, is centering race equity as a core goal of social impact across the sector. And the way that we do that has been through the research, which we'll go through today, but we also do convenings periodically. We had a 1-day convening in DC in May, and some of you, if you're planning to go to Independent Sector, could join us for a pre-convening to Independent Sector in Chicago on November 12th. But in addition to creating tools and resources based on the publication, we do convene across the social sector to bring together folks to talk about how to operationalize race equity. So to have a conversation similar to what we're going to have today. Cool. And the results for today's conversation is that those of you on the call will be introduced to our research and resources, mainly, as Deborah said, in preparation for the deeper conversation next week, just to get you thinking in advance. But you'll understand the key research findings from our publication and how to think about applying the race equity cycle framework in your own work. And we'll talk specifically about some management and operational levers that you can use to shift organizational culture toward race equity. And so today's meant to be an introduction. We're happy to answer questions, and this will set us up well to have a deeper discussion next week. We like to start with grounding the conversation in some definitions, because often there are as many definitions of race equity, diversity, inclusion, equity as there are participants in the conversation. And the lack of a shared language is one of the key barriers to progress in dialogues on race equity and then to the work itself in terms of culture change inside of organizations. So for the purpose of equity in the center's work and of our conversation today, as well as next week, we define race equity as the condition that would exist if you disaggregated all of the social outcomes, indicators, or data in society broadly. So housing, education, income, incarceration, health outcomes, all of those things by race, there would be no disparity. So that is what equity would look like in society. And we're very far from that, since race is the biggest driver of disparities in our society. So we just like to ground ourselves in that definition and really that vision of what we are working toward in broader society. When we talk about applying a race equity lens, what we mean is that at every inflection point in your work, whether it's a decision or a partnership, an investment, bringing someone onto your board, hiring an ED, hiring a mid to junior level person, raising a fund, selecting a vendor, at each of these inflection and decision points in your work, you would pause and consider the potential disparate impact of that decision or partnership or investment by race. So what are the potential unintended outcomes of whatever it is we're trying to accomplish by race that we may not be considering? And often organizations will use a race equity impact assessment tool to help give some structure to those questions, those investments and partnerships. But that's what we mean when we talk about applying a race equity lens. And as we go through the research, we'll talk about what applying that lens means along the race equity cycle at the 3 stages: awake, woke, and work, and then around the 7 levers specifically. And lastly, race equity culture, I mentioned this a little bit earlier. We define that as a culture that's proactively focused on counteracting inequity and driving race equity inside of the organization as well as outside of it. Building a race equity culture in the social sector. For those of you who had the opportunity to read our publication or maybe our blogs or just our infographic, this will be familiar to you. So essentially, this is the body of research we use to make the case for building a race equity culture. And this data comes from Building Movement Project as well as Board Source. But we talk a lot about Building Movement Project's Race to Lead report, which also came out, like our paper, in 2017, and characterizes and put data around what they call the racial leadership gap. So if you look on the left-hand side of the slide, that's what you see. And some of this data comes from Board Source, but was also referenced in Building Movement Project's report. So traditionally, when we talk about diversity, inclusion, and equity, there's been a belief that the more people of color you bring into the sector, any sector, quite frankly, could be for-profit, finance, medicine, but we're talking about the social sector here. The more people of color you bring into the sector, quote unquote, naturally over time, those individuals will rise to the top of the sector. We've been applying that thinking for 30 plus years now, and you see where we are on the left-hand side of the slide. So people of color are about 40% of the general working population in the states, and we are 10% of CEOs, 10% of board chairs, and 16% of board members. So the distance between representation in the general working population and at the highest level of the sector, as reflected by CEOs and board membership, that's the racial leadership gap. And our belief is that structural racism drives the racial leadership gap. It's not a lack of qualifications or capacity or interest. And so that brings us to the other data that's featured on the slide. So in the middle, Building Movement Project asked the question of participants in the Race to Lead survey, which is incidentally currently open for another round of data. The survey will stay open until September 12th. So they're basically redoing the survey from 2017 again in 2019 to update the data. But one of the questions they asked then and that they ask now is, do you want the top job at your organization? And if you're a person of color, you were more likely to have said yes in 2017. And we highlight that because often traditionally in these conversations about diversity, folks will say, well, you know, people of color aren't necessarily interested in the top job. So Building Movement Project's research was really groundbreaking in that they asked, and this is what they found. On the right-hand side of the slide, the level of education speaks to what is another traditional response to why people of color are not at the highest levels of the social sector, which is there's a pervasive belief that people of color are not qualified for those jobs. And so Building Movement Project's research found that there is no statistical difference in the level of education and qualification between white people and people of color in the social sector. In fact, in some cases, people of color are over-degreed, particularly if you look at Black women. But there is a tendency to try to stack degrees to demonstrate oneself to be more qualified and credible as a person of color, though you see on the left-hand side of the slide that doesn't necessarily result in more senior leaders of color. But what it does mean is that people of color are capable, are qualified, are credentialed, but we're not getting the jobs. And so that leads us to our race equity cycle and thinking about building a race equity culture, because our philosophy, our theory is that if organizations are actively building a race equity culture, that the racial leadership gap will be closed over time, because qualifications and credentials aren't keeping them from the top job. Interest isn't keeping them from the top job. It's institutional and structural racism inside of organizations and across the social sector. So what we've coined the race equity cycle reflects how organizations, leaders, managers, entire teams can work together to center equity in their culture. So I'll give you an overview of the cycle before Andrew goes through some of the levers in greater detail. But I have been talking a bit, so perhaps I can pause and see if there are any questions. Deborah, I don't know if there's a chat room or something where folks can
I'm monitoring the chat box now, so if you do have questions, feel free to type some in and we can answer a few before we move on to the race equity cycle content. Or
you can feel free to use the Q&A box. We'll monitor that as well. So if you put a question in, we'll read it out loud and then get Kay or Andrew to respond to it.
Cool. All right. Well, I can get started and let me know if any questions pop up. So with the Wake, Woke, and Work, what we did is reframe diversity, inclusion, and equity slightly differently for a couple of reasons. Through the research that we did in 2017, our stakeholders overwhelmingly felt that the word diversity and the term DEI, or some folks call it EDI, is often used as a checkbox inside of organizations that aren't actually committed to equity, that just want to name diversity, say it's a priority, but not do the deep work of shifting culture to center equity. And so they recommended that we move away from using DEI. So hence we reframe diversity, inclusion, and equity as Awake, Woke, and Work. So the awake stage is the diversity stage, as most folks would call it. And at that point, organizations are focused on representation. So increasing the numbers of racially diverse people, focused often, sometimes exclusively on counting the folks of different races that work at the organization, that apply to the organization, that are on the board. But that's where the discussion and the work often ends. It can, as we sometimes say, live and die in HR. HR is a critical partner in the work of inclusion and equity, but it cannot be where the work begins and ends. And at this stage of the work, the awake stage, the work lives in HR because it's seen exclusively as a recruitment function. So getting more people of color into the organization, counting them, counting applications, counting the folks that are hired, but then not giving thought to the experience of those individuals once they begin working at the organization. So the culture of the organization at this stage is what we would call white dominant. There isn't thought given to what the lived experience of people of color is outside of the organization or inside of the organization, and there's a belief and sort of active language around assimilation into the culture of the organization. So the white dominant standard is sort of what is the rule of the day if it is in fact a white dominant organization in terms of the numbers of folks who work there. But this can also be the case at organizations led by people of color. Just because an organization is led by a person of color or is predominantly people of color, it doesn't mean that the culture of the organization is not white dominant. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. At the woke stage, what folks traditionally will call inclusion, that's when organizations are beginning to think about what it is like for people of color living and working inside of the organization and in broader society. So here's where an organization will start to actively name that they have a white dominant culture and name that they are going to begin the process of moving away from that by first naming the different lived experiences of people of color inside of the organization and outside of the organization. And then in a social organization context, make the connection between, the explicit connection between those lived experiences and the organization's capacity to achieve its mission, which in the social sector, we're generally disproportionately serving Black and brown communities. So talking about how having folks who live and work in the communities that are served, how those folks bring great value and assets to the organization and better position the organization to strategically be able to attain its mission. This is also where you will see organizations starting affinity groups, sometimes not just by race, but by gender, by sexual orientation or gender identity, and policies, processes, vendor partnerships, contracts, all of those things would be reevaluated to center equity. So this is a very long stage of the work. In 2017, we found that organizations can move through a stage in 3 to 5 years, but they can stay for up to and sometimes more than 10. The work of inclusion is very resource intense and takes a lot of time, and we'll get a little bit deeper into what that work entails as we go on through the webinar. The work stage is what folks generally call equity. And equity, as we define it and talked about a little bit earlier, is the vision. It's the outcome that we're working for. So an organization at the work stage is proactively focused on driving equity inside of the organization and outside of the organization. So the way that would look inside of the organization is that they would have disaggregated all of their staff, compensation, performance, promotion, retention data by race, and implemented clear initiatives to mitigate those disparities inside of the organization. Then they would have policies and procedures and a culture in place that would maintain that lack of disparities even as staff continue to turn over. And you'd see the organization elevating equity capacities for leaders at every level of the organization. Another example we like to give at the work stage is if an organization, for example, makes a public statement about a humanitarian crisis, and this happens a lot in the current political climate, unfortunately. So if we're talking about the crisis at the border or even gun violence, the organization wouldn't rely on individuals of color or directly impacted by the humanitarian crisis. So say first-generation Americans or folks who have recently immigrated or years ago immigrated to the country. You wouldn't rely on those members of the team to craft all of the language around such a statement. So what we found in our research is that organizations at all stages of the race equity cycle release these statements when things happen in society. But only when organizations are at the work stage have they built the internal capacity for those statements to be written in an inclusive and respectful and representative and inclusive manner by individuals who are not members of the community directly affected by that crisis. So there might be a process in place where the statements are vetted by a panel of advisors or partner organizations, but it wouldn't be a situation where a leader goes to the one person of color, for example, on the C team and asks them to write a statement about tragedies in their own community. Around the outside of the circle, you see the 7 levers. So senior leaders, data, organizational culture, learning environment, board of directors, communities, and managers. And throughout the research, these are where we found clusters of best practices that organizations had used to measurably shift their organizations through the cycle. And for each of the levers, the publication outlines what an organization looks at the awake stage, at the woke stage, and at the work stage. And what Andrew is going to pick up and do from here is dive into awake, woke, and work and what those profiles look like for some of the levers we'll spend our time talking about even more deeply next week. Were there any questions, Andrew?
Yes, there is one question here. It says, can you talk about how POC should respond when we get told we are lucky to be talking about race and equity in the workplace because it's not the norm? And not the norm was in quotations.
That's a tough question. How would I respond, or how would I recommend you respond? Probably two different answers. I mean, the short answer is that calling that question is a reflection of institutional and structural racism. That may not be something that you're comfortable saying, but what happens in white dominant culture and in organizations that are at the awake stage or even the pre-awake stage, as we sometimes call it, is there's a focus on assimilation. And when the norm is assimilation to white dominant culture, the pervasive belief is that people of color should be lucky. They're lucky, number one, to have jobs in those organizations. And they're lucky that we are acknowledging the pink elephant in the room, which is structural racism that drives disparities more so than anything else in society. Race is the biggest driver of disparities when you cut all data in the social sector. So I wish I had a better answer for you. Toni Morrison passed recently, and so there's a clip going around about her response to a journalist's question about why she doesn't write more about white folks in her books. And her response was, you don't have any idea how profoundly racist that question is. So I'm not saying that that is the best response, because calling someone a racist or noting that institutional or structural racism at play is not the best way to call people in, but I would encourage you to call that question as a reflection of institutional bias, because stating the obvious is not something for which you would feel lucky, especially when the status quo and the norm is harmful to you as a person of color, or harmful to people of color, in case the person asking the question isn't a person of color. So the status quo is harmful to people of color. Not naming race and racism, expecting people to assimilate to white dominant culture, to subvert aspects of their identity, which are the literal defining aspects of their daily lives, is harmful. And no, one should not feel lucky for being part of a conversation about race in a predominantly white organization where someone would think that it's acceptable to ask, to make that statement. I'll stop there. Andrew, did you have?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I would also add that I think many folks think that people of color are going to be happy about having these conversations and doing this work within organizations, and that's actually just not necessarily correct. This work is difficult and actually sometimes makes things that aren't apparent to folks very apparent, which makes going into those organizations and working even more difficult. So it's really not about luck at all. This is hard work, and oftentimes makes life harder for everyone in that organization. So I think I just want to put that out there as well.
Andrew and Kay, before you go ahead, we have another question that I think it would be really helpful if you'd answer now.
Great. Yes, here it is. So it says, how can we better meet the suggestions in smaller agencies with no HR departments, not a lot of open positions or turnover? I think most partnerships orgs are small. So the
Yeah.
question, Kay, is really the one about, smaller organizations and how to do and drive this work.
Sure. That is a question we get in every webinar and every working session, because it's the reality most of us in the social sector, in the nonprofit sector, are facing every day. We're part of ProInspire, which is itself a small nonprofit, so I understand the context for that question, and I want to acknowledge it as being real. It's the struggle we all face every day in terms of allocating resources and time in a small organization. That having been said, the recommendations in the publication stand even for a small organization. The insights, the best practices, the context for institutional and structural racism, and the need to address oppression, structural oppression, at the 4 levels at which it exists, which is internalized or personal, interpersonal, institutional, and structural. All of that still applies in an organization of 7 people or an organization of 7 people. What is different is the execution. So how you would go about approaching this work, the way you would resource it with a very small budget, for example, and no HR staff, the way you would approach transparency around data. So one of our big recommendations, and I mentioned this as we were going through the cycle, is that folks disaggregate their data by race around staff compensation, performance, retention, and promotion. And if you do that in an organization of 7 people and then you share that data with the team, everyone knows who is where in the graph. And so in small organizations, that's one thing that we definitely see folks approach differently, that if you disaggregate your data, there's a very intentional strategy for sharing the findings from the disaggregation and sort of framing the changes that the organization will make to respond to any disparities that were identified. But organizations can identify, small organizations without HR staff can identify strategies to implement the recommendations in the paper. It's just going to look a bit different. So maybe if you have a fiscal sponsor, or you use an external provider for HR services, or you use power or in-kind support from the board or other partners, you can still implement the practices in theory. It's just that the execution is going to look a little bit different. The other thing that will happen in small organizations, but this honestly also happens in very large organizations, is you're going to have to make decisions, often really hard decisions, about the prioritization of resources to drive progress on race equity. So for example, you may decide, and I'm just using HR because that was what was asked about, you may decide to invest some funding in hiring an HR consultant, for example, who could look at your policies and practices and reframe them around equity, or support the team in doing some management training, or any number of things. But as a result of hiring that individual, you are not going to do something else. So you're not going to do strategic planning. You're not going to send the team to some other training that you were planning on. And even very large organizations have to make that trade-off. Like Demos did a video case study with Equity in the Center. They published a case study on their race equity transformation work, which we highly recommend. It's on their website. That came out at the end of last year. When Heather McGee became the president of Demos, equity was part of her platform, so to speak, and they decided not to do strategic planning so that they could invest the money they had planned to allocate to consultants for strategic planning to consultants for race equity. So ultimately, you'll have to make some hard choices. Andrew, is there anything you'd add from folks we've supported?
No, I think those are really, really great examples. And I would just reiterate exactly what you said, that at the end of the day, there are hard choices that have to be made, but if you are choosing to center equity, that's what's going to come up. Any other questions before we kind of dig into some of the levers? I'll wait a couple seconds and move into it. And feel free to put them in the question or chat box, and I'll keep an eye on them as I go. So thanks, Kay. So as we look around the race equity cycle, you see that there are really 7 levers, and Kay mentioned, which are really the clusters of best practices that organizations were activating to go through the race equity cycle. And so those 7 levers are senior leaders, managers, boards of directors, community, learning environment, data, and organizational culture. And today we're going to get through at least 2, hopefully 3 of them. We'll go through senior leaders, boards, and org culture. And this section, what we really want participants to take away and see and hear is what it looks like, sounds like, feels like within those organizations to go from awake to woke to work. You'll see in the next slides that we're going to go through that progression, but there's a set of policies and processes, personal behaviors and beliefs, and data that back up that particular lever in that particular stage. And so really try to notice the progression as we go through these. And so I'll go through one of the levers. At the end, there'll be some little mini case studies of actually how this work showed up within organizations. And then we'll leave room for questions on that particular lever afterwards. So here we go. So for the senior leadership lever in the awake stage, at this point, senior leaders believe that diverse representation is important, but they're really not comfortable discussing anything tied to race, both within the organization, and you'll probably find that externally within their networks elsewhere. Kay mentioned this earlier as well. At this stage, most of the DEI-related policies and practices are really all embedded within HR and not embedded throughout the whole organization at large. And at this point, senior leaders have started to gather some data around race disparities in the populations in which that organization is serving. In the woke stage, excuse me, senior leaders are prioritizing an environment where different lived experiences and backgrounds are really viewed as an asset to the organization and actually viewed as something that can help the organization attain its mission. And Kate talked a little bit about that as well. They're starting to evaluate hiring and advancement requirements that ignore system inequities and reinforce white dominant culture, such as things like kind of graduate degrees or the pedigree of those said degrees, and things like unpaid internships. Because as we know, only specific people from specific socioeconomic backgrounds can actually afford to take unpaid internships. And then in terms of data, senior leaders are disaggregating internal staffing data to identify areas where actual race disparities do exist within the organization, such as compensation, promotion, professional development dollars, etc. So you'll see that with that data piece, it's very important to do that disaggregation by race. In the work stage, at this point, senior leaders are modeling the responsibility to speak about race, dominant culture, structural racism, oppression, all of those issues, both within the organization and driving those conversations within the organization, and also advocating for it outside of the organizations with stakeholders, peers, partner organizations, community, etc. They're also showing a willingness to review, again, personal and organizational oppression and have the tools to analyze their contribution to that structural racism. So in a lot of organizations, they'll be having conversations, they'll be doing some of the work, but really this is where the racial equity lens muscle comes into play. So at some point, the organization is going to have to really review how it's showing up, how it's perceived within the broader systems in which they operate in, and have the tools to analyze their contribution to structural racism more broadly. They're also at this point illustrating through longitudinal outcomes data how their efforts are impacting race disparities in the communities in which they're serving. That's just a fancy way of saying that, you know, in the awake stage, you're starting to collect data. And over time, you're going to see some trends in that data, both within the organization and in the communities you're serving. So that longitudinal outcomes data is just trends that you see over time, but you're actually collecting that data and disaggregating it by race. And so how does this actually show up within an organization? Here's some good examples of how this worked. So in the awake stage, Leadership for Educational Equity, or LEE, I'll call it from now on, analyzed disaggregated program data to identify how many people of color were actually participating in those leadership programs. And that particular program was about who was actually running for elected office in local municipalities. And for some, this might seem like a low bar in terms of actually tracking who you're serving, but this is a great place to start. At LEE, they also set and communicated goals around diversity, equity, and inclusion across all of their programming, and also incorporated that into staff performance metrics. And based on where they were within the organization and with individuals, they adjusted their strategy upon those quarterly reviews at both the department and organizational levels. The last one here on the work stage, Lee had a 4-month pilot of executive coaching for their VPs that expanded into a year-long investment. And those VPs were receiving specific coaching around diversity and inclusion to help them both with their own individual learning journeys around how race shows up within their own identity, and then also how that actually shows up within the organization and their leadership moving this work forward. And I'll also just say here that we've found that equity coaches, although it's quite an investment, has actually done a really great job of helping move individuals and organizations in driving and sustaining race equity work so far. And so it's a large investment, but it's something that actually helps move people. And it's really the concept of it's like an executive coach, but it's particularly for things tied to race, inclusion, equity, to help with their own individual learning. Okay, I'll stop here if you have anything to add specifically about lever or the equity coaching.
Thank you. That was great. What I would add, I guess, is the difference between equity coaching and leadership coaching. So there are leadership coaches who can coach for equity, and there are leadership coaches who are very pre-awake in their orientation to building a race equity culture, as we would call it. So coaching is critical because it helps people understand how equity fails, so to speak, happen in daily management practice, in meetings, who you're calling on, who you're not calling on, like whose voice is validated, microaggressions that are committed in meetings, in one-on-one meetings with staff, just conversations. As one, in theory, thinks through and develops an understanding of equity practices, the application of those practices in the daily decisions that leaders and managers make in terms of how they communicate and support others in their organizations is really critical, and coaches are really crucial partners in that work. But it's important that the coach have equity capacity training and rich experience. But we've found that for a lot of the organizations we've worked with, that it's really a game changer. We also do want to acknowledge that it costs money, and it's quite cost intensive for organizations who choose to give coaching to their entire C-suite, and sometimes to senior managers and managers of teams.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll give a couple seconds for any questions around the senior leadership lever in particular, and feel free to ask questions along the way as well, and I'll get to them when I finish up that lever. But if there aren't any questions, I'll move on to the board of directors lever, which you'll see some similarities between that senior leadership lever and the board of directors lever. So in terms of the board of directors lever, you see, again, in the awake stage, the board is really not comfortable discussing anything tied to race at the board level with individuals on the board or in terms of actual meetings, board meetings, etc. They are really focused on diversity at the board level at this point. So they're really seeking individuals from various racial backgrounds for board seats, or, if they're looking for a new executive director, president, or CEO position, really focused on diversity. And they've got a limited understanding of what race disparities in the populations that their organization's actually serving. So really not analyzing race within the organizations at this point. And at the woke stage, the board's starting to create and sustain some practices, some shared norms, policies, practices, visions, values that foster an inclusive environment that really encourages different viewpoints and different people within the decision-making process. And they're also evaluating board memberships that ignore system inequities. Again, like things like pedigree of institutions, minimum donation amounts. We get a lot of questions around the minimum donation amount with boards that have to fundraise. We understand that a lot of boards, especially with smaller organizations, are fundraising boards. And so having a conversation about what that might look like to get rid of or think through what minimum donations might be is a tricky situation. But at the end of the day, there are specific people historically that have generational wealth where people of color often lack that in many cases based on structural racism and the history of America. And so that's something that I'll let Kay kind of talk about when I get through this slide, but we have seen some organizations have some sort of sliding scale around minimum donation amounts. We have yet to see any organization really work through that well, because at some point, it's really about power dynamics on the board. So if I'm giving $30,000 to sit on this board and Kay is giving $5,000, whose voice is really going to matter when we're making decisions? And that's really something that has to be managed well, and it can get complicated. Kay, do you want to add anything here about that minimum donation amount?
Yeah, we've had folks say they're working on this for years, sort of to transition their board from some sort of a large give or get to something lesser, or a mix of people giving large amounts and small amounts. And the power dynamics are really difficult to manage. So we've not seen anyone successfully shift from a large give or get to no give or get, or to a sliding scale successfully. Everyone's sort of in the process of figuring that out, at least the organizations we engaged with during our research. We did find that organizations who were founded with social justice values and either never had a give or get, or when they founded the board had a mix of people writing large checks and people giving in-kind services or representing the community, that they were successful, but they weren't trying to right the ship. Those were their founding principles. So there are organizations like that exist, and they were founded on social justice principles. And often folks will commit to a stretch gift through a confidential process with the ED and the chair of the board, and that works for them because their power dynamics have always been mixed in that way. We find that trying to transition from all large checks to some mix of large and small checks is more complicated. We do have a local colleague in the DC region at a community foundation who, rather than try to manage the multi-year process of trying to switch from a large donation to a small donation, changed the bylaws of the board to add about 5 additional seats for people who do not write checks. Those individuals are members of the community, and that's the gift that they bring. The whole board brought into that, and a cohort of people were brought in after the bylaws were changed. We've also seen organizations create similar positions through the bylaws on their boards for community partners. So the individuals who fill those seats don't write checks. They're representing an organization of which they are the chief executive or a board chair, and they are a partner of the organization in some capacity, generally programmatic. So those are just some examples of how we've seen folks deal with it.
Thank you. So yeah, that's a very tricky one. And in terms of data in the woke stage, you're analyzing disaggregated data and root cause of race disparities that impact the organization's programs and the populations in which they're serving. In the work stage, for boards of directors, at this point, the board is actually leading the process procedures around shifting culture from white dominant norms to ones that center race equity. They're working to eliminate bias and disparate treatment within the organization and externally as well. The exact same thing here around policies and processes. They're showing a willingness to review personal and organizational oppression, and then have the tools to analyze how they're contributing to structural racism inside and outside of the organization. And in terms of data here, this one's really, really important. They're holding the executive director or the CEO accountable for all measures related to CEO performance on race equity. And they're making sure this work is resource intensive, and so both in terms of financially and in terms of time. So they're making sure that proper resources are allocated to support the work at every stage. And there's also one question here that I want to, someone asked if we're sharing the slides, and we'll share a bunch of different resources after the session. But most of the things that we're going through right now is actually right in the publication. I think it's right in the lever section. So if you want to actually dig into more of that here, we just pulled out some for the session here. Great. And in terms of boards of directors and little mini case studies here, Europe conducted a review of its board member selection process, and then based on where they fell in terms of outcomes, they actually revamped the composition of the board to include more racially diverse alumni. And they were doing that with the express purpose of providing a specific and unique perspective and skill set to the board in which they did not have prior to. Again, at Europe in the woke stage, the board was engaged in its own learning around DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion. The organization also was creating a special task force, which we hear a lot, which is kind of an organization will set up some sort of DEI task force that's charged with doing its own learning, driving the work internally as well. But this one specifically was comprised of both board members and staff to make specific recommendations for organizational change. We've seen this happen a number of different ways. It really does help when you have a cross-section of individuals at different levels within the organization and within different verticals, however that organization chooses to organize itself. In the work stage, Europe added trainings on diversity and inclusion to all of the board onboarding process so that every board member had the same kind of shared context and base level knowledge of all things diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the board's quarterly learning sessions were focused on specific topics that were relevant to Europe's work around the student populations in which they're serving. This one here is really, it's really essential, because just as Kay shared some of the terms in which we were going to talk about today, like race equity lens, and race equity culture, again, for as many people are on this webinar, there's probably that many definitions of what any of those specific terms are. So getting people together who are going to be driving this work need to have some shared context and shared language moving forward. And so this is a really great example here. I'll stop for a second, see if there's any questions around boards. It's one of our favorite levers.
Andrew, there is one in the Q&A.
Oh, here we go. Thank you. How do you help shift the board who is very pro high give or get in fundraising? How do you help shift the board who is very pro high give or get in fundraising? That's a really tough question. And in terms of fundraising, if that's kind of what the organization is doing for sustainability, that's a difficult question. We've seen a few organizations try to do some sort of sliding scale. I would say for organizations that have a very high give or get, at least starting the conversations around what that actually means for the organization and the challenges that it might bring up if you were to switch or shift that sort of high give get. That's a really hard one, because it's really talking about the sustainability of an organization.
Yeah, I would agree, Andrew. I mean, like with small organizations, but honestly, even some larger nonprofits, we've come across can't do without the money that comes through the board. And so, as Andrew said, those individuals are then asked to do the work. They are also presented potentially with some alternatives to shifting the bylaws in the ways that I mentioned earlier, which mean all of the folks on the board will continue to give whatever they give, but potentially will bring on individuals who are representatives of partner organizations, or will bring on individuals who are representative of the communities that we serve. The honest fact is, or the truth of the matter is, that if you take a board, any board, whether they write $20,000 checks or not, through the learning process around, or that underlies or is part of building a race equity culture, you may potentially lose folks over time. So if you keep a board that has a large give or get, the work that is required to build a race equity culture, to develop a shared language on race, to support them in doing this work at the 4 levels I mentioned earlier. So, internalize personal, what they think, their personal beliefs about race and racism; interpersonal, how those beliefs affect the way that they interact with other people; institutional, the way racism shows up in institutional policy and practice; and then structural, the broader system of society in which all of these things work together, not just for racism, but for oppression in general. That work is still required. And there are people who may opt out of the work over time. And so that can happen with boards. That also can happen, it does happen with staff. So as a part of doing this work over a period of years at the depth that is required to build a race equity culture, there are some people who will say that this is not for them. And that may happen with the board that writes big checks. It may happen with the board that writes no checks.
Yep. Great. Thank you, and good question. So we're going to move on to organizational culture as our last lever of the day. And in the awake stage, Kay mentioned this earlier when she was going over the race equity cycle. But in terms of org culture, the organization is aware that white dominant workplaces and cultures exist, but expect people to adhere to those dominant norms to succeed. And so that's another way of saying what Kay was mentioning earlier around assimilation, asking people of color to leave some of their identity at the door to be successful within your organization. And we see this all the time with organizations. And it's one of the harder things to analyze when you don't know that it actually exists. In terms of policies and processes, the org is at this point sharing its commitment to all things diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of the onboarding process for new employees, which again is something that we just heard is a great thing to do for the board, but it's also great to, it should be something that you're doing for new employees as well. They're also emphasizing increased diverse staff, representation, but really not focused on anything around retention issues. So again, it's the pipeline conversation, not the inclusion conversation. Actually, and I'm going to stop here for one question. Should the idea of an equity task force come from staff or originate from the board? Does that change if the board is still in the awake stage? Kay, what would you say here?
It depends. We've seen it originate at all different levels. A board that is awake can start or pre-awake can still sometimes green light a task force. It happens all different ways. You'll see organizations that have an equity committee of the board before there's any work done with the staff. I'm not saying that that's a best practice, but we've seen it happen in any different number of ways. I'd say what's critical for the board is that the board be engaged in race equity work in parallel with the staff as much as possible. You never engage with them at the same depth because of the nature of governance, but they need to be brought along in as close a cadence as possible to the full staff to support the work that the staff will develop over time. But task forces will sometimes start after engaging a consultant whose recommendation is that a task force be started. We've seen task force start with a staff volunteer who is most often a person of color, or a group of volunteers who are predominantly people of color. If you're looking for a best practice around how to manage task forces, whether they originate in the board, whether they originate with a CEO, or they come from like the bottom up, like the staff got together and requested and pushed for this, the key success factors are that the task force be cross-functional. So it represent people across the organization, you know, all divisions and departments, however you frame that, and that the most senior level of the organization be represented and the most junior level of the organization be represented. Often task forces are a sort of volunteer undertaking. And if there isn't an intentionality about building out a task force that reflects all aspects of the work that the organization does and has senior level participation to signify the importance of the work and to drive it forward. I have seen cases where members of a board will sit on a task force. It's generally the individual from the board who chairs the equity committee or is a member of the equity committee. So I'd say cross-functional, top to bottom participation, clear scope of work, clear goals, time-bound goals. Those are the things that will drive the success of a task force, not whether it originates in the board or not. But something that a board is perceived to be pushing through with no buy-in from the staff will not ultimately be successful.
Right. Great. And I would just reiterate what Kay said around specific scope and goals and outcomes of that task force. Without specific goals and outcomes, we've seen often that task force actually has little to no teeth to actually make any sort of, to drive any sort of change within the organization. And we also see that the task force itself will get very worn out from trying to do the work and butting up against whatever organizational barriers there may be in terms of actually driving the work. So that's also very important. Thanks for that question. And so we'll move on to the woke stage in terms of organizational culture. At this point in the woke stage, orgs are really compelled to discuss racially charged events with their staff when they occur, but they're doing that without placing any sort of responsibility or undue responsibility on people of color to explain or defend themselves. Their communities are the ones that are actually being oppressed. And so we see this a lot of the times. A lot of organizations we've worked with, the work started, race equity work started when there was a killing of an unarmed Black man in their community. And so the organization and the individuals within it were having these conversations, which is great. But a lot of the times, again, like Kay mentioned earlier, the responsibility to have those conversations, to facilitate those conversations, or to write that specific, comment for the organization around what's happening externally is that responsibility falls on a person of color. So that's really what we're trying to get away from. But having those conversations with the internal capacity, building the internal capacity from all members of the organization is crucial to drive the work. Again, in terms of everyone working to drive race equity, in terms of policies and processes, the expectation to participate in race equity is across all levels of the organization, from C-suite all the way down to entry-level positions, and from every vertical in the organization. There's also a long-term strategic plan with measurable goals for creating an equity culture and understanding really the organizational needs to realize those specific goals based on which populations the organization is serving, et cetera. In the work stage, in terms of organizational culture, At this point, the organization is fostering a positive environment where people feel that they can raise race-related concerns about policies, programs, funding, etc., without experiencing any negative consequences or risk being labeled a troublemaker or too loud or unhappy, etc. And so we see this, we say this because oftentimes the people that are most vocal about inequity within organizations are people of color because they're experiencing it every single day. And oftentimes we find that if people of color are too loud about the inequity that's in organizations, they often find themselves not in that organization anymore. But it's often not because they're raising those issues, it's for other performance related problems. And so at the end of the day, we see, in reality, people of color are getting fired because they're raising issues around inequity within organizations. And in the work stage, organizations are actually have the internal capacity to actually work through the inequity with people of color and white folks together. In terms of policies and processes, at this point, the organization has threaded accountability across all efforts to support and sustain racial equity. So again, it's from the C-suite all the way down. And each individual, each department has its own learning goals, its own performance metrics around race equity in terms of achieving that race equity culture. And they're also assessing achievement of social inclusion through employee engagement surveys. And so here, this is really important, even for small organizations, to really get a baseline and understanding and perception of how employees, what's their actual experience within your organization. You're not going to know how people feel without doing some sort of employee engagement survey. And many of the organizations we worked with want to do this, and almost every single organization we work with said that, especially in the senior leadership team, that they were not ready to. It's hard to hear some of the things that come up through these employee engagement surveys because people, people say what they feel, and so I think one of the important pieces of doing these employee engagement surveys is the management and share out of the actual material once you collect all that data. One organization in particular, before doing the engagement survey, thought that they were going to just share the data out to everyone in the organization. And after receiving that data and receiving those comments, they decided to share the necessary information, but keep a lot of those things within the senior leadership team because it was necessary to actually drive the work. So it's really about the management of and the transparency and how you're sharing that information. Kay, would you add anything there in terms of the employee engagement surveys?
No, just that they're easy. I'd say they're an easy lift and often an easy first step. If organizations do an annual survey, which many do, but don't ask questions about race or discussions of race or perceptions of inclusion in the workplace, or many organizations don't even collect in those surveys the optional demographic data. So, people often ask us where to start. And I think if you have an existing staff survey into which you can build some questions that would begin to give you some insight into how, where your culture is on race and race equity, it's a great place to start. And it gives you some clear data on which to build subsequent discussions.
Great. And I'd also say I have seen one engagement survey. I'm sure there are more and we'll share this in follow-up. But one of the best kind of online curated resource centers is called racialequitytools.org, which has a bunch of information, a bunch of resources, but on that site, they have at least one employee engagement survey that you can take a look at to help draft your particular one if you're looking to do that. And we'll follow up in a follow-up email with those types of resources.
Oh, and we can take the opportunity to talk about the Building Movement Project assessment. So we mentioned the Race to Lead series of reports, which are mentioned in our publication, and the survey is currently open for 2019, related to the questions they ask about building a culture that centers equity in the Race to Lead survey. They're going to be launching later this year a pilot for nonprofits that are interested in doing an assessment aligned to their Race to Lead survey. So they're looking for, I think, 100 organizations to pilot that assessment later this year, and then it will be released to the public more broadly in 2020.
Great, which is very exciting. That's great. Okay, so we'll go through these last mini case studies and open it up for more questions. So in the awake stage in organizational culture, Leadership for Educational Equity established a DEI team or a task force to set a vision and define positions, language, and curriculum to achieve those particular outcomes. At Europe, they created a design team of cross-functional staff that was diverse in terms of race and function, and that team met regularly to do deep dives to improve the organizational knowledge and organizational internal capacity around all things diversity, equity, and inclusion. In the woke stage, Lee created identity-based employee resource groups, or you might have heard them as ERGs, that invited cross-functional staff to discuss their experiences and identify actions the organization could take to support them. I would also add here, in terms of employee resource groups, there are many ways to kind of do that. Some are formal, some are informal. At Annie Casey Foundation years ago, it was an informal group of people of color who actually started to get together to talk about the equity work happening within Annie E. Casey Foundation. And that work actually became much more formalized as time went on. And they were actually a big reason that the work within Annie E. Casey they were really driving that work. And so it started as an informal thing and moved to a very formal thing as years went on. There's, again, a strong need to outline the goals of the employee resource group. So sometimes the ERGs are really for folks to get together and build community with a specific identity. Other times it's really, depending on the power of the group, it really is to make recommendations for specific outcomes. But you really do need to make sure that everyone understands the scope of that specific group. At Europe, they held conversations with senior leaders to create clear definitions for diversity, inclusion, equity, etc., prior to writing their diversity statement, which it's an interesting one, because we see so many organizations write a diversity statement for their organization and post it on their web. And then when we go in and talk about and ask them what diversity or inclusion or equity mean to them, they have trouble answering that question. And if that's the case, then you'd have to wonder what that diversity statement is actually upholding within their organization. At Annie Casey Foundation, they define the work of race equity, as well as the organization's need to understand and embrace it internally, as mission critical. So they made a clear and explicit connection between the race equity work and the foundation's overall outcomes. And what's interesting here is that when you think about Annie Casey Foundation, when you think about the work they do, a lot of it comes from the Kids Count initiative. And so when you hear that, you don't necessarily think race, but because they're talking about all kids. But when they really dig down and when you read the Kids Count reports, they really are focused on race and the disparate outcomes of specifically brown and black kids in the communities in which they're serving. And so for them, they have a whole onboarding process of how they talk about Kids Count so that it's as inclusive as possible and is a large umbrella for all kids. But when they really get down to the actual work and who they're funding, it's primarily based on race and brown and black kids. Kay, would you add anything to that little story around Andy and Casey?
Nope, that makes sense. And, they have the communication guide, which supports the staff in talking about what Andrew just said, and everyone's trained to pull the thread from data to ultimately a focus on mitigating race-based disparities among young children.
Great. Any questions around the organizational culture lever or any of the levers that we've gone over? Got one. Here that says, is it helpful to put this in the context of change management? I found it helpful and wonder if the facilitators agree. I'm thinking about the intentional disruption this creates and the need to prepare for the disruption, similarly to how organizations should prepare for other kinds of changes / disruptions. I absolutely think that in terms of change management and preparing an organization to do this work is necessary. This work is messy, and Kay often says organizations have to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And another one of our colleagues, Erica Hines, really talks about this work as you have to work the muscle of equity. You have to flex the muscle, and over time, things will get easier. But when you go to the gym and you start working out for the first time, it's hard to do. You get sore. It gets harder before it gets better. And I think that's the same thing with equity work overall. The messiness and the ambiguity in which this work entails makes people feel highly uncomfortable. And we're also socialized and racialized in this country not to talk about race and inequity. And so many people get uncomfortable with that. And so the reality is that's the actual work within the organization. And so I think it is a great way to say that this will feel messy because it is, and things might get messier before they get clearer for organizations. And Kay mentioned this earlier. The reality is for some organizations, when you start doing this work, some individuals might opt out, and that means that they might leave. And that's also the messiness of this work. Other questions? Thank you for that comment. Well, great. It seems like there aren't any more questions. And if there are, feel free to reach out. We'll see most of you next week. I don't know when it's scheduled. I think it's next week. But we really want to thank you for joining us. Oh, we got one more here. Here we go. Thoughts about how to engage staff members of color who don't self-select for the equity team?
I will follow up on that. And then Andrew, I'm sure you have some thoughts as well. But as we were wrapping up, I was thinking about the question that was asked earlier about how to respond to the question or the statement. You're lucky that we're focusing on race if you're a person of color. I would remind everyone of what Andrew said when that question was asked, which is that people of color are not necessarily excited when race equity or equity initiatives kick off. Like if you spend a lifetime boxing up your identity and all the sort of pain and challenges around that in your workplace as well as in addition to your life outside of your workplace, that's not something that people necessarily want to talk about. And there are some clear differences along generational lines. So if you look at millennials versus Gen X versus baby boomers, who are much more inclined to want to keep those feelings in the box because that's what they were socialized to do when they came of age, versus millennials, which are coming from a very different place, versus Gen X, people who came of age during a different time. So to get those folks engaged, I think something that often works is affinity spaces for staff of color, though affinity spaces are not just for staff of color, they're also for white folks, they're for folks of different identities. You can do a range of affinity spaces, but individuals who are reluctant to engage or to volunteer might have a more transparent conversation with their colleagues of color in an affinity space about why they don't want to engage. So I would recommend potentially creating that resource for them, ideally with an external facilitator and with some clear guidelines around what an affinity space is, because people often don't know what it is and are concerned about confidentiality. The second thing I'll say is that it's not the obligation of people of color to participate in these initiatives. It's not the obligation of people of color to dismantle a system that was designed to oppress them. That obligation rests with the individuals who are preferenced by the system. So there is no expectation or obligation for people of color to participate beyond what your average member of the team might have to do. So participate in the survey, go to the all-staff training, do the all-staff activities, but there should not be any expectation that they, quote, step up, so to speak, because it is not their obligation to dismantle a system of oppression that marginalizes them. So I'm assuming that the question is about, just engaging them in a meaningful way to support the work overall, as a full member of the team. And so I would recommend an affinity space, but would caution against any expectation that they give more, do more, because that's not their obligation. So when the individual asked the question earlier about what to say when someone says, you should be happy or lucky that we're focusing on this, the individual has no obligation to respond as a person of color, because the folks of color don't have any obligation to explain or to participate on issues of race and racism. And that is really important, not just to understand, but to name as part of this work, because people of color are the default speaker on these issues time and again. And it's exhausting. And it is not their obligation to participate, to explain, to help, to make comfortable. So I would say create space for them to have transparent conversations about the trauma that they've experienced in the workplace and in life. And hopefully that's a space where they can talk more about why they're not participating or why they're not raising their hand, but no additional pressure should be applied to them to get them to step up, so to speak, because that's not their job.
Yeah. And I would also add that I've found in my own experience that for many people of color within organizations, this isn't their first time having this conversation with that particular organization or the organization they were in before. And they probably think it's not going to be their last conversation either. So I think they have a very valid and kind of, they have a skepticism to the work, because this conversation has been had over and over with little to no action, even if it's not even within your organization, if it's within, broader society at large. And so it's skepticism, but it's for a reason. And so I think, there's many reasons why folks of color might not engage. And that's just another one. And there's another question here that says, working in a very small nonprofit, I find my colleagues discussing racial equity, but not moving forward through these stages. As the only POC, I find it difficult to push for this work and don't find it my obligation to do so, but value this work. What's your response or guidance to this?
Did you want to respond, Andrew?
I think it's exactly what Kay said before. It is not the obligation of the person of color to drive the work internally. Just as it's not the person who's being oppressed to do the work for any sort of marginalized identity. At the same time, if you are passionate about this work and you do care about this work, one really great way to drive the work internally is to find some sort of, to build relationship, but also find some sort of race equity champion within your organization, or someone that has shown some sort of inclination to do this work, and work with them specifically. And it's even better when it's someone from that privileged or preferred identity. So in your case specifically, it would be a white person. If you have a relationship with that specific person, I would work with them to figure out strategies to move the work forward and use their identity and leverage that identity to move the work forward. But I would say that overall, as someone who's been in that position, it's very lonely work. And you have to be able to figure out how to leverage the privileged identity in that space to move the work.
Yeah, like find an ally, as Andrew says. So I think, you could share our publication as a resource, but to be frank, as Andrew said, that resource coming from someone who is not a person of color will be received completely differently. So while it's great that you don't see the work as your obligation, because it's not, and we definitely don't recommend folks of color take this on, because it is actually a burden and contributes to weathering. Having meetings before the meeting with someone you perceive to be a strong ally who is white and can make the case for this work in a way that we as people of color simply cannot, because we're dismissed as we speak because we only care about it because we're people of color, that's really critical. And when we look at organizations that have been successful, like either in moving a full organization and moving a chief executive or in moving a board, it was collaboration and co-conspiring, as some of our colleagues will say, between folks of color and white allies who pushed for change. Because white allies pushing for change on race equity is received differently than people of color pushing for change on race equity. And then there's just the issue of weathering. So often when folks ask for people of color to raise their hand or are surprised that people of color are not, or even when people of color are interested in doing what this person asking the question is seeking to do voluntarily, there is a cost that comes with that. So what I would ask you as a person of color to be mindful of is self-care and, preserving yourself as you push for this work, because there are professional costs to it, political costs to advocating for diversity or race equity as a person of color. A study came out on that recently, how Black women in particular are penalized more so than other folks of color for raising issues of diversity as something that should be addressed. So there's the political part of it, but then there's also the health aspects of it, the real price that people of color pay for having to manage through these issues with their colleagues on a daily basis, which is why we have to manage asking people of color to participate very carefully, because there is a physical toll to what you are asking them to do when you ask them to engage in discussions of race and racism in the workplace, when they're going to have to devote a lot of energy to explaining. And I think we are at time.
Yes, and that was all of the questions. So
well, we actually do have 3 other questions. 2 of them are from people who will be at the meeting, and so I think we can address them there. And then we have an anonymous attendee who wants examples of successful retention policy changes, and so I'm hoping you can share those with me after the webinar to share to people.
Great. We can definitely do that.
So thank everyone. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and I really want to thank Andrew and Kay for this wonderful webinar. It will be recorded. You will get the slides. Those of you who are able to join us at the retreat, we will be going further in on this whole conversation at the retreat, and then we'll be figuring out what our next steps are, because we certainly see the retreat as a first step and not as, the end of the process. I'm going to go ahead and close out the webinar now, and I thank you all for being particularly patient with our efforts at learning to run a new webinar system. I apologize for getting started a little late. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.